While we're in this vein, you were one of the first candidates to come and speak publicly, or come out and speak publicly about reparations for slavery.
Yes.
Can you explain how your plan would work and how much you're willing to spend?
I believe that in order for this country to transform, we must apply moral and spiritual values. And a universal spiritual value is that you must admit the exact nature of your wrong, whether it's Catholics going to confession, whether it's Jews on the day of holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, or 12-step recovery groups where they talk about taking a fearless moral inventory, admitting the exact nature of your character defects. Abraham Lincoln in 1864 wrote a proclamation, a day of fasting and prayer, where he said that a country too must confess its sins. We have a national character defect that has been with us from the beginning, and that is racism. Now, I do not believe that the average American is a racist. I do not. But I do believe that the average American is undereducated about the real history of race in the United States, particularly since the Civil War. I think most Americans might not realize, and I do think this would have been different had Abraham Lincoln lived. At the end of the Civil War, Tecumseh Sherman, General Tecumseh Sherman, promised to every former slave family of 4, a phrase we've all heard, but not really perhaps thought deeply what it meant, 40 acres and a mule. Now think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Let's say you've kicked somebody to the ground, and let's be clear, 2.5 centuries of slavery is definitely kicking someone to the ground. You have a moral responsibility in my mind, and I'm sure in yours, to do 2 things. Number 1, to stop kicking, but also to say, here, let me help you get back up. So as Martin Luther King would say 100 years later, they were freed, but what were they freed to? With that 40 acres and a mule, you're a former slave. You certainly have a skill set. You've been running other people's plantations. Those 40 acres and a mule would give you a chance to be integrated economically into the new condition of freedom. That's not what happened. In most cases, once again, had Lincoln lived, it would have been different, I believe. In most cases, the acreage was not given, and even where it was given, in most of those cases, it was taken back. And that was then followed, once the federal troops left in 1877, that situation was followed by Southern legislatures passing what were called the Black Code Laws. Black Code Laws ensured subpar economic and social and political opportunity for black people. After that, you have your spate of lynchings. This was domestic terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. Ku Klux Klan, that's domestic terrorism. Lynchings, domestic terrorism. But so then you've got the war over in 1865. You've got the federal troops that were stationed to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted. They left in 1877. By the year 1900, you had full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. That was not fundamentally addressed until Martin Luther King in the 1960s. So you have 2.5 centuries of slavery and then another 100 years of institutionalized violence. With the Civil Rights Movement, with the Civil Rights Act in 1864, they did, and we shouldn't minimize or undervalue the sacrifices and the struggles of our ancestors, black or white. This was extraordinary what they did. In 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act dismantled the externalities of segregation. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act ensured free and equal voting opportunities for blacks. It's also worth noting, ladies and gentlemen, that in 2013, our Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why all these voter suppression efforts have occurred throughout the country. So in other words, we abolished slavery, we dismantled segregation, and we gave equal voting rights, although we started to compromise there. What we never did was address the economic gap that began with the end of the Civil War and has never been able to close. We now have a situation where if you're a genius, if you're a, Tyler Perry or Magic Johnson, then you're going to make it no matter who you are in America if you're enough of a genius. That of itself is not economic justice. The nation of Germany has paid since World War II $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Obviously, this can't make the Holocaust not have happened. But those reparations have gone far towards reconciling Germany with the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. So you've got, that war was over in 1945, and you've got a young generation of Germans who aren't carrying this toxicity on and on and on. Our war was over in 1865, and we are still carrying this because it's time to take the next big step. And that is why I believe we should have reparations for slavery. It won't make slavery not have happened. This is an issue where we must address external and internal issues. But there is such great moral force, spiritual power. We need more than just random acts of kindness now. We need to do huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. America's done great things before. This is time for us to now take the next great step. And reparations implies an apology at a deeper level than just I'm sorry. So there could be a council of black leaders, and that today means American descendants of slaves. And choosing those people would be a huge issue. We have great black scholars who have worked seriously on this issue, as well as leaders in culture and academia and politics, et cetera. And the number would be negotiated, of course, and then over a period of, let's say, 20 years, it would be dispersed and applied as this council chose for projects of economic and educational renewal among American descendants of slaves.
So more specifically, you're talking about schools and economic development
rather
rather than direct payments?
Well, there are a couple of ways. There are two things to remember. First of all, if I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. On the other hand, the U.S. government would be handing over a lot of money, and we would certainly have the right to have some minimum stipulation. And yes, that has to do with economic and educational renewal, projects of economic and educational renewal. That's why the selection of this council would be a very significant process that I hope all Americans would consider themselves
So
part
just
of.
specifically, it wouldn't be individually targeted, because certainly there are situations that are fraught here, because you could have a black African who is not a descendant of
Yes, but
slaves,
that's
who suffers racism as well.
Yes, but these days there is a lot of talk about ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. So that is to be honored, and this would have to do with people who are American descendants of slaves, not an immigrant from Nigeria, let's say.
Okay, and not to belabor the point, but 23andMe is teaching us all sorts of, Ancestry.com, that there are people who would probably otherwise be identified as white and have not suffered from racism, but they may have descended from someone who is a slave. Would they be eligible in some way, even if they are not
That wouldn't be for
ethnically
you
black?
and me to decide.
The council. Okay.